guys, when we talk about art history, it is important that we talk about the history itself, but you also need to understand the artist. So before we delve into the actual paintings themselves, let's talk about Botticelli himself. Because you see, for the longest time, I feel like Botticelli was not necessarily the best appreciated artist. Well, what we know about Botticelli is the following. He was born in 1444 or 1445. Birth records are a little bit tricky at that time in the area of Florence, where he actually lived the vast majority of his lifetime. And Botticelli is one of those artists that kind of changes not necessarily careers altogether, but that's like a little sidestep. Because originally, between 1459 and 1460, he actually trained as a goldsmith, where we think he probably got the name Botticelli from. This seems to be, by the way, his artistic name, not necessarily the way that we know him overall. Well, after 2 years as a goldsmith, he actually decides to swap over to painting. And then he starts training with perhaps one of the most famous masters of the time, a man called Fra Filippo Lippi in Prato. And he's going to be there until 1467, where he kind of breaks off and starts his own workshop. Now, this formation period with Fra Filippo is going to be very important because, you see, Fra Filippo was actually a Carmelite monk. So for a very long time, the art that Botticelli is going to be living and breathing is mostly going to be religious art. And this is going to be very important. You're going to see in the way that his art develops overall. So, like I was saying, eventually he leaves the workshop of Fra Filippo Lippi and he starts his own workshop actually in 1470. And very shortly after this, we see that he becomes an important artist because in 5 years, he's managed to secure the patronage of the Medici family, who of course are perhaps the most important family in Florence and in Italy at that moment in time. So that's going to secure a lot of his career advancements. But, well, for a very short period of time, he will leave Florence. Is pretty much the only time that we think Botticelli properly left for work, or at least for an extended period, to go to Rome and work in the Sistine Chapel Commission, which we will be talking about later on. But literally, he goes, does the work, comes back to his studio in Florence in 1481. So as you can see, he was very much rooted in the area. And we know that he was actually working until his 60s, if I remember correctly. I think he was 60 something, because when he dies, we have records of him paying fees for the Guild of Artists up until 5 years before his death. I believe the fee records go up to 1505, and he dies in 1510. So we know that at least to some extent he was still carrying out, but obviously something quite nasty seems to happen to him in the last 5 years of his life, because by the time he dies, we know that he's pretty much, poor. He's completely broke and bankrupt and in really bad health. So maybe that's the reason why he had to give up art. We're not entirely sure exactly of the full process. And part of that is also one of the reasons why for a really long time in history and in art history specifically, Botticelli is kind of going to be unknown and obscured as an artist. Not many people were paying attention to him. And that also has to do with movements that will happen throughout the Renaissance period. Botticelli was, of course, very influenced by late Gothic art. If you think about it, we're talking of the 1400s. The Quattrocento is essentially international Gothic everywhere else. So one of the problems that Botticelli has is that although his art is very good, very shortly, after he becomes important, and particularly around the time period where he's an old man and then dies, very important people like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, most importantly, are going to shape art history in such a completely different way that he will almost become démodé and forgotten very fast. So it will take up until the 19th century with the Pre-Raphaelites to rediscover Botticelli and kind of bring his art back to the forefront. So this is something that often happens in art history, even though you may be very, very good. You're only, as good as your last piece. And if someone else comes around and does something outrageous and wonderful, you become forgotten very fast. And it's actually the Pre-Raphaelites that you're going to see will have an impact as well in the restoration of some of Botticelli's paintings.